I knew it was going to be tough to put it on pole, but this I didn't expect. All weekend we have been struggling. FP3 was actually not too bad, but then we tried a few more things on the car for qualifying, and that I think tipped it over and it became undriveable. That was the words of Max Verstappen after qualifying 11th at the Singapore Grand Prix. Red Bull are the team who have won a record-breaking 15 consecutive races in a row, stretching back to the end of last season, and going back even further before Singapore, they had won 24 Grand Prix in 25 races. This was a weekend that even the biggest of Red Bull skeptics could not have seen coming. Although the car, as expected, got better in the race than it did in qualifying, the only teams that Red Bull managed to out-qualify were Williams and Alfa Romeo. So what happened to the most dominant car in the history of Formula 1, and how did it open the door for 3 different teams to fight for the win? Going into the weekend, there was a lot of talk about a brand new technical directive TD018, which was used by the FIA to clarify to the teams and clamp down on flexible bodywork. Now, with only one race as a sample size, there is no way that any of Red Bull's struggles can be put down solely to that. We'd have to see a clear trend in the next 2 or 3 races to really say if it had any effect, because as Christian Horner so adamantly put it after qualifying and also before the race on the grid to Martin Brundle, the reality is that's the car that won in Monza 2 weeks ago, it won in Zandvoort the week before, in fact it won all of the other races. Other than wing level, nothing has changed. The only thing that's different is the track. Since there was nothing different about the RB19 in Singapore, it means that this car, with the way that it's designed, is just fundamentally not suited to the characteristics of the track. And now, Max already hinted that coming into the weekend, they expected to struggle more than usual because when they did the sim work driving the car in both Singapore and Suzuka as the races are back to back, in Max's words, the same car that felt horrible around Singapore then felt perfect when he drove it around Suzuka. I think not only is this yet another sign that the technical directive is a complete non-issue for Red Bull, but given how dependent Suzuka is on high-speed aero efficiency, don't be surprised if Red Bull are back to their dominant best. The team knew that they were in trouble right from the off. Throughout practice, both Max and especially Checo were constantly on the radio complaining of rear instability, and even just riding on board with them, you could see that not only was the car struggling to turn in, but it was a real handful at the rear. And now, I do have to say that the team itself hasn't actually given us a black and white reason as to why this track didn't suit their car, and even if they do know, I'm sure they'll try to keep as much as they can from us, and also the other teams. The best explanation from all of the available knowledge and from talking to the people at Red Bull came from Mark Hughes from The Race, and I'll leave a link to his article below if you want to get the full scope. The simple explanation is that Red Bull's biggest advantage has been that because they have the best floor and suspension design on the grid, it's allowed them to run their car lower than anyone else, which allows them to fully utilize the downforce that's generated by the ground effect, but not at the cost of making the car bounce or unstable, which is down to how the suspension works in combination with the floor. At Singapore, there was a perfect mix of unpredictable variability. To deal with the bumps, the team brought a softer suspension setup that compromised them massively in the part of the track that had been resurfaced as they couldn't utilize the extra grip. Because of the bumps, the car also had to be raised above its optimal ride height, because if it hadn't, there was a worry that during the race, the plank would be worn away, and thus, during scrutineering, the car would be illegal after the race. Taking the car out of its optimal ride height and bringing a softer suspension that didn't work with that ride height meant that the car was bottoming out in braking zones due to instability, and in the corners the car wasn't reacting or generating the same level of downforce, because the car fundamentally just wasn't working its tyres in the way that it was designed to. This meant that not only was it a mess through the corners, but as we saw after the safety car restart, both of the Red Bull drivers couldn't get their worn hard tyres to fire up and give any kind of performance. We have seen drivers struggle to get worn hard tyres to work on safety car restarts, and I go back to Lewis in Abu Dhabi in 2021 as probably the most famous example of a driver being a sitting duck. The same happened to Max. After the safety car came in, Russell overtook Max immediately, Norris a lap later, and then Hamilton 2 laps after that. The team during practice experimented with different setups, and we actually heard some of this when Checo was asked by the team for some feedback. They also tried a different floor all the way up to FP3, but in the end for qualifying they decided to bite the bullet and go back to the same floor that had won them the previous races. But as Max said at the beginning of the video, not only did that not improve anything, but it tipped it over the edge into the disaster that we saw in qualifying and then the race. And now, the Red Bull was always going to be better in the race than it was in qualifying, because even when the car has been competitive on literally every single track that we've been to so far this season, whilst the fight for pole has been pretty close in places like Monaco, Hungary and Monza, in the race Red Bull have always been a level above the rest. In qualifying, as I mentioned earlier, Red Bull were literally the 8th quickest team on the grid, but come race day both Max and Checo were able to capitalize on the fact that the majority of the grid was really conserving their pace to try to protect their tyres, which seemed to shift the balance more towards Red Bull and brought them back up to being the 4th quickest behind Ferrari, Mercedes and McLaren. Looking ahead, I think a lot of people will start to wonder, could we see anything like this again for Red Bull on any of the other tracks? In reality, my answer to that would be no. Singapore is a very unique track that's actually tripped up dominant teams in the past. In 2015, right in the middle of a dominant Mercedes season, both of their drivers failed to qualify in the top 4, and then neither finished on the podium as well, with the team being confused as to where their pace disappeared. It's just one of those tracks that, along with being a street track which brings its own challenges, stands out as a driving and technical challenge for the teams. The only race that might give Red Bull a hard time is Sao Paulo. We know they struggled with setting up the car there last season. It's also a sprint, so even less time to solve any issues that might arise. And with the bumpy nature of the track as well, it might just be enough to bring the competition closer to the front rather than pull Red Bull back. I think it's also worth talking just a little bit about the fight up at the front, because although Red Bull struggled, the fact that we had 3 teams all within contention for a race win fighting all weekend long was just exactly what F1 needed. I have talked about before on my channel that whilst you have to respect what Red Bull have done, it doesn't mean that F1 hasn't been a little bit boring and predictable this season. Singapore just felt like a total cleanse with pretty much all of the drivers in the top 5, all in contention of grabbing that win. The fact that the strategy and timing of the safety car and VSC gave us that sprint to the finish with so much tension and excitement, as we didn't know if the Mercedes were going to be able to catch and pass Lando and Carlos for the win in time, it was just a breath of fresh air, and it was definitely the race that F1 needed. A special mention has also got to go to Carlos Sainz, because this was by far his best ever performance in Formula 1. I have always felt a little bit guilty because when it comes to his first ever win at Silverstone in 2022, I don't think that it was that good of a race by him. He wasn't even the best Ferrari driver, there was lots of circumstances that helped him, and despite it being his first ever win, I wouldn't even put it in my top 5 Carlos Sainz performances. Singapore, however, was a Sainz masterclass. He has had the pace the entire weekend right from FP1. That pole position lap I think is arguably even better than his previous one at Monza. And then in the race, although I know Leclerc fans won't be happy with how Ferrari used him, it was a great team effort to manage the pace up at the front, not make any gaps for the teams behind to try and undercut them. And then Sainz also drove brilliantly in the final stint to not wear out his tyres too much before the end of the race, and then to also give Norris the DRS at the right time to just halt the progress of Russell and Hamilton charging behind. A Red Bull struggling in Singapore has well and truly shaken up the season. It brings Ferrari to within 24 points of Mercedes, meaning the fight for P2 in the Constructors is well and truly on. Hamilton, who arguably looked like the fastest driver out on the track, now climbs to 3rd in the championship after his 5th podium, and Lando, since McLaren brought those upgrades in Austria, has been the 3rd highest scoring driver in that time, giving the team a huge amount of hope for next season. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.